Excellencies, distinguished speakers, dear participants, a very good morning, and thank you to Professor Dechen Tsering for inviting UNEP. It's a pleasure for UNEP to be at the inaugural Circular City Summit 1.0. It was heartening to hear from industry this morning on their commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals, just transition, leaving no one behind. And you've already heard about a very close working relationship with the different UN agencies. Last year in 2022, the UN General Assembly recognized the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a human right during its 76th session. But to provide a regional context, when we start to look at the Sustainable Development Goals, we did the progress report in 2023, and you looked at all the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Progress has been really slow. By 2017, we'd progressed 4.4%. By 2022, we'd progressed 14.4%. And we're going to be several decades, we're going to miss the targets by several decades. So you think about urbanization, and you've already heard about living in an increasingly urban world. You've heard that 56% of the global population live in cities. Our region is home to 15 of the world's 28 megacities, and 2/3 of the world's population will live in cities. We're experiencing in Asia the fastest rate of urbanization. We're going to add 44 million people to city populations, and by 2050, we're talking about an increase of 1.2 billion new residents. So, this really is an issue for the Asia-Pacific region. UNEP has been collaborating with cities, and we've really been looking at supporting low-carbon, resource-efficient green growth and looking at policies for climate adaptation and mitigation. We've also been promoting circularity and sustainable consumption. And when you look at sustainable consumption and production, this is goal 12. And you start to look at the recent G20 in India, they talked about lifestyles for the environment. And you start to look at, how our consumption and production patterns really affect sort of planetary boundaries. UNEP works with high-impact sectors such as plastics, textiles, electronics, and food. And a lot of the work that we're doing really is looking at science. So when you look at the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you look at the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, there's already a lot of science. We have the Global Environment Outlook. This is where we bring subject matter experts together, and UNEP is working towards the 7th Global Environment Outlook, and we are producing the 2nd Global Waste Management Outlook. So actually, if you look at science, data, information, it already is there. But unfortunately, much of it is siloed within separate communities. So we talk about cities facing the challenges of the triple planetary crises, and you heard about it already this morning, the crises of climate, the crises of nature loss, and the crises of pollution. Cities both drive the triple planetary crises and also deal with the consequences and impacts of it. So we look at greenhouse gas emissions. 75% of greenhouse gas emissions are environmental impacts and resource utilization in cities. But to know that 79% of global greenhouse gases are from the G20 countries. So we really have to look at where we focus, and then you start to look at, the different sectors. So we have a good idea where the global greenhouse gas emissions are coming from. We know cities face challenges. We've already heard of climate-induced floods, fires, heat waves, droughts. A few days ago, we launched the Adaptation Gap Report, and closer to COP28, we will, launch the Emission Gap Report. Basically, when you look at adaptation and resources for global, adaptation, there's a figure of needing about $200 billion. Today, we're getting about 20 billion, and that number is decreasing. And very soon, you will hear about the Emission Gap Report. We're already at warming of 1.1 degrees. Remember, Paris said we had to stay within 1.5 degrees. And so the window to stay within 1.5 degrees is closing. It's really closing. And I was in Pakistan last year, and you had heavy monsoon floods, and you looked at the devastating impact of just heavy monsoon floods. So we're already facing, in a warming world of 1.1 degrees, the consequences. So this becomes, we always talked about climate change as for future generations. It's actually our generation. We're going to face the impact. It is real. So we heard already about urban heating as a major issue for cities, and we're working on something called the Cool Coalition and the COP28 presidency, United Arab Emirates. They're looking at announcing a global cooling pledge. So like a methane pledge, I mean, these are important to get countries together. Pollution challenges cities and their livability. I mean, last week you couldn't breathe the air in New Delhi. Schools were closed. All our offices, governments in the UN, everyone was at home. You couldn't breathe the air in New Delhi. So we know that cities are hotspots for air pollution. Most of us now breathe unhealthy, unclean air, and we're looking at 4 million premature deaths. So we also know, and you look at water pollution, you look at soil pollution, there were numbers. And we're also responsible cities for more than half of waste generated globally, and you're talking about plastic waste. And a lot of this is increased consumption levels, but it's also that we don't have waste infrastructure in much of the global south. In many parts of Asia and Africa, we don't have the waste infrastructure. So we're looking at policies to implement and support countries address air pollution, to adopt integrated solid waste management systems, driving towards a zero waste world. And we're talking about biodiversity and how it threatens cities. And I mean, we've already heard about COVID-19. COVID-19 was a zoonotic disease. And what happens when you break infrastructure, you break nature, you start to have wildlife trade, you put things on top of one another. COVID-19 actually brought home the impacts of an unsustainable world of planetary boundaries. I mean, people actually took climate change seriously after COVID-19 because the world came to a standstill. So we're looking at the importance of ecosystem-based services for cities, and we're talking about focusing on nature becoming part of the solution. You heard already earlier about nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based adaptation, and you're really hearing about ecosystem restoration in cities. So the triple planetary crisis is underpinned by unsustainable consumption and production. So you've heard about the linear thinking. It's a take, make, waste world. And consumption of natural resources adversely impacting our health, wealth, and society. And you heard earlier about looking at the economic model. And you heard really about looking at the financial infrastructure. I mean, really rethinking I think Mia Motley's really talked about how do we design our financial systems. So we're talking by 2050 of global material use expected to double if consumption and production growth rates remain the same. So this significantly addresses adversely, ability to tackle climate, loss of nature, and pollution, ultimately just jeopardizing our current well-being and the future well-being. And one very important principle for the environment is the whole intergenerational equity. And we're hearing very loudly from youth, and they're engaging very actively. I mean, Fridays for the Future is really about what are we doing to their future. And more of them are saying nothing about us without us. So we need to have, in circular cities, you need to bring the youth in at the table. You need to have more voices. So to combat the challenges caused by consumption and the linear model of economic development, we're going to need a transformation in how, in our policies and businesses, decisions, lifestyles. And this is going to be essential at this current stage, but it has to come with just transition. It has to come with looking at jobs, looking at the economic well-being, of addressing poverty, of equity, and being inclusive. So this week in Nairobi, In the United Nations Environment Assembly gets together every 2 years, and this is where the ministers of the world discuss the environmental issues. And they agreed in 2022 to develop an international legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution. Negotiations on this, the INC3 is taking place in Nairobi, and a lot of focus is on the full life cycle of plastics. I mean, there are countries who want to discuss the downstream impacts, but I was in the Pacific a week ago, and they said they really want to think about how we redesign, how we rethink, how we look at extended producer responsibility. So cities are critical players in the transition to circular plastic economy as they face the consequences of unmanaged plastics and drive for solutions to reduce plastic pollution. And a panelist earlier talked about how interdependent we are and how transboundary the issues are. So you can have extremely good sustainable waste management practice, manage your waste. You look at Japan, but you're going to get plastic waste from other parts of the world. It's going to come ashore. So we are all really, and someone said we're all in this boat together. I think we're all in this storm. We're in different sized boats. Some of us, we're really at the forefront. So cities, circular economy does provide opportunities for cities in our region. So we look at, and I keep focusing on consumption patterns. Circular economy does not only cover efficient use, recycling, disposal of materials. It looks at the entire value chain. It looks at how we design the long-lasting, reusable, repairable, as well as safely recyclable and disposable. So cities in our region are at the core of accelerating this transition to circular economy, as we see demand for raw materials alongside the population. And I mean, today we're discussing things like deep sea mining. Do we now go into, do we mine minerals, critical minerals in the deep sea? So when we start to think about circular design principles to how we plan, how we construct, our mobility, our food systems, our waste management, and how to address livable cities by reducing environmental and social harm caused by unsustainable consumption and production. So it's really also circular economy and opportunities to strengthen local economies, to create jobs, address environmental challenges, and to allowing cities to make peace with nature while protecting our health, livelihoods, and well-being. So a UNEP report found that the built environment sector accounted for 37% of energy and process-related carbon dioxide emissions in 2021. So I think we talk about promoting circularity across the life cycle of buildings. How can we repurpose buildings? We heard about repurpose earlier, and resulting in 50 to 75 lower carbon emissions compared to construction of new buildings. And a transition to circular economy in the built environment is estimated could lead to 40% reduction in global carbon dioxide emissions in 2050. So we do know, what we need to do to reduce emissions. We need to address our energy systems, we need to address built environment, we need to address transportation, and we need to address food systems. A third of all the food we produce for human consumption is lost to wasted. So you think of the loss of energy and the loss of water, and also the release of methane emissions. So by harnessing a circular economy in the food system, especially by upcycling, reducing food loss and waste, we can drastically reduce emissions, improve people's health, reduce impacts on surroundings, ecosystems, win for climate, well-being, and for nature. I saw a statistic that if food loss was, a country, it would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. So this is at a level, at the local level, at the national level. And of course, we look at sustainability in cities through sustainable mobility, diversifying modes of transport, informed decision making. And here we're working sustainable mobility. An example with us in Indonesia, where we're working with the Ministries of Public Works and Housing in a national vision for non-motorized transport. The strategy aims at creating comfortable, inclusive, comprehensive walking and cycling spaces. I've been asked also to look at urban manufacturing and accelerating circular transformation. And again, when we talked about since the Industrial Revolution, the global economy focused a linear model of production and consumption. And also, if you start to look at the economic model, it doesn't take into account the externalities. And pollution is an externality, undervaluing of ecosystem services. I mean, so we really have to rethink our economic model. So, so we talk about urban manufacturing as a way a city can scale circular economy uptake, a broad set of manufacturing from small scale craftsmanship to small factories, traditional urban manufacturing, and it can make efficient use of products and materials. And again, focusing on extended product lives through repair, reuse, extending life cycle of materials by remanufacturing, also making sure that there's resource efficiency, and that when you look at the current linear value chains and raw material extraction, of trying to make sure that we really focus on things that are localized. And here again, when we look at urban manufacturing, to make it socially and environmentally sustainable, we have to make sure it doesn't contribute to more pollution, whether it's air pollution. Here we can make sure that emission standards for factories, we can monitor air pollutants, such as volatile organic compounds, and ensure sustainability of urban manufacturing increases. Also, promoting urban manufacturing would modify urban employment and the job landscape. And you've already heard about the increase of youth. We're looking at our region is soon going to be home to 700 million youth, and here's an opportunity to work with them to unlock opportunities and to connect the use of natural resources of the sector to the people we employ, to monitor jobs in the circular economy, providing local insights into both environmental and societal performance of sectors. And I think one of the reasons why climate is so complex. I mean, we have the Montreal Protocol where we addressed ozone depleting substances, and we're soon going to close the hole in the ozone. But with climate, it's complex. It's what we eat, it's energy we use, it's how we live, it's transport, it's jobs, it's looking at, again, there's a lot of discussions on common but differentiated responsibility, because there's also the historical legacy of countries that emitted greenhouse gas emissions and the right to develop for countries, for economies. And that's one of the reasons why the issue is so complex. But green jobs is an opportunity, and here we can look at formal and informal sectors. We look at adequate skills for circular and green jobs. UNEP, the International Labour Organization, UNICEF, we have a pact, Green Jobs for Youth Pact, and really it's to make sure that the job market goes hand in hand with green and circular transition to create employment opportunities for youth. And this is why a just transition becomes so important. You have to have a just transition. Earlier, we heard about public procurement, and public procurement is an important tool for decision makers to increase circularity. This can be at the national, municipal, and city levels. You can incentivize manufacturers, service providers to adopt circular and sustainable operation models. At city scale, you can incentivize sustainable urban circular manufacturing through public procurement. And you can procure products that are circular by design, locally produced or manufactured, or have lower environmental impacts. And cities can drive sustainable urban manufacturing. In many OECD countries, public procurement wields enormous purchasing power, up to for an average of 12% of GDP and up to 30% of GDP in many developing countries. So you can leverage this purchasing power by promoting public procurement practices that are sustainable in accordance with national policies and priorities, play a key role in achieving sustainable consumption and production and a circular economy, and supports progress across the social, environmental, and economic pillars of sustainability. So we've been working in this space over the last 4 decades, UNEP. We have a methodology to assist countries to design, implement sustainable procurement policies. In doing so, it's working with governments to deliver on solutions that bring a range of benefits for people and for planet. So we've heard that cities are the future for the majority of us. Urbanization is happening now, it's happening fast, especially in Asia Pacific. And we know the transition to circular cities provides an opportunity to secure livable urban centers that are in balance with the planet. But this is going to need action. It's going to need our collective responsibility to ensure a healthy and sustainable environment for current and future generations. So we need partnerships. We need governments, the private sector, civil society to ensure that we facilitate a resource efficient, healthy, nature positive, carbon neutral city. We all have a role to play. And that's one of the reasons UNEP values partnerships so much. We work with the World Circular Economy Forum, which is one of the world's leading platforms to accelerate circular economy through multi stakeholder collaboration. So when I talk in closing, and we've heard about politicians, and you've heard about the multilateral environmental agreements. And what happens is countries negotiate these multilateral environmental agreements, and then you have national action plans. So like in climate, you have nationally determined contributions. But what can happen is that when industry works on these nationally determined contributions, these national action plans, you can accelerate the ambition of countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I think industry and as individuals, I mean, how we consume, how we produce becomes extremely important. It's going to take all of us. So we have much of the frameworks. I mean, you have the Paris Agreement. This is a legally binding agreement under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. This December, we signed the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and you can look at the targets for nature, and a lot of it is linked to food systems. And this September, at the Fifth International Conference on Chemical Management, we adopted a global framework on chemicals that sets concrete targets and guidelines for key sectors across the entire life cycle of chemicals. So these global frameworks are there. Our countries have signed up to it. We've signed up to the frameworks, and we have these national action plans. But what is missing is the time it takes. So we're now negotiating, and I've talked about the legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution. And during this process of governments negotiating, we're having multi-stakeholder forums. So please join the process. We no longer, when we negotiated the Paris Agreement in 2015, and we took about 8 years to complete the Paris rulebook, we don't have time. We are at 1.1 degree warming. We don't have time. So we need industry, we need civil society, we need all of you to engage in these multi-stakeholder forums. Work with governments to talk about what is possible to implement, what is possible. So we're going to need all of society to engage to implement the important frameworks. And as UN Environment Program, I work on a lot of these environmental issues. The most some of the smallest agency at the national level are the ministries of environment. We don't have the resources or the capacity. So I was really happy to hear that capacity building is happening by industries and associations, because we need to create the momentum. We need to work with our national governments to make sure that we can actually stay within planetary boundaries. We're looking at planetary boundaries, and we're looking at starting to think about, we don't know what the challenges are going to be. And so we're really talking about two principles. One is intergenerational equity, and the other is precautionary principle. If you don't know the impacts, be careful. So I look forward to working with you on the game-changing innovative policies, technology, financing mechanisms, stakeholder engagement, political support for sustainable cities that we need. And I thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you.